She tightened her grip on the stagecoach rail, looked the giant cowboy in the eye, and said, "Touch me once without my permission, and I'll be gone before sunrise." He answered by taking one quiet step backward, and the folded paper hidden in her bag suddenly felt heavier than ever. The stagecoach rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving only the sound of creaking leather and the Colorado wind pushing through the pines. Every eye in Dry Creek seemed fixed on the woman standing alone beside her worn travel bag. Across from her stood Caleb Turner, a rancher whose silence had become legend long before his size had. Sarah didn't lower her gaze, even as her fingers brushed the folded document hidden inside her coat. Someone had already started looking for it, and if it reached the wrong hands, neither of them would walk away untouched. Stay with me, and tell me in the comments, would you have climbed into that wagon or turned around while there was still a road behind you? The stagecoach reached Dry Creek just after 3 in the afternoon, rattling over the last stretch of hard road beneath the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. Dust rolled behind it. The leather traces creaked. Somewhere near the livery, a hammer rang against an anvil. Caleb Turner stood beside his wagon with his hat held low in one hand. At 42, he was taller than any man in Dry Creek. 6'7" in his worn boots, with shoulders shaped by years of fence posts, winter timber, frightened horses, and cattle drives through narrow mountain passes. His dark cattle-hide coat made him look broader still. A pale scar crossed the bottom of his chin, left by a young stallion many winters earlier. People had given him names: the Stone Hollow Giant, Turner's Bear, the man who never raises his voice. Caleb had never answered to any of them. A boy carrying a crate of apples came around the corner of Martha Quinn's store, saw Caleb blocking half the street, and stopped too quickly. The crate tilted. 3 apples bounced into the dust. Caleb stepped aside at once. The boy gathered them without looking up. Across the street, 2 ranch hands lowered their voices. Caleb heard his own name, followed by a short laugh. He kept his eyes on the stagecoach. He had learned young that a man his size did not get the luxury of careless movements. One hard look became a threat. One raised voice became a story. One angry moment could follow him for 20 years. Rebecca Shaw had taught him that. She had once promised to marry him. Then she watched Caleb pull a drunken drover away from a boy the man was striking behind the grain warehouse. Caleb had thrown the drover down and held him there until Sheriff Reed arrived. The boy went home alive. The town remembered only the sight of Caleb standing over another man. Rebecca had returned his ring the next morning. Since then, Caleb had kept his hands to himself and his explanations even closer. The stagecoach door opened. An older salesman climbed down first, followed by a mother carrying a sleeping child. Then a woman appeared in the doorway with one worn traveling bag and a straight-backed stillness that did not match the weariness in her face. Sarah Bennett. Her brown dress had been carefully mended at both cuffs. Dust marked the hem. Her dark hair was pinned beneath a plain hat, though loose curls had escaped near her temples. She paused on the step and looked over Dry Creek as if measuring every doorway and every road leading out. Then she saw Caleb. Her eyes moved from his boots to his shoulders, then to the weathered face beneath his hat. Her hand slipped into the pocket of her dress. Caleb noticed the shape beneath the cloth. A pair of sewing shears, perhaps, something narrow and sharp. He did not move toward her. "Sarah Bennett?" he asked. His voice was low enough that the men across the street had to lean closer to hear. She climbed down without accepting the driver's hand. "You're Caleb Turner?" He nodded once. Sarah looked at the wagon behind him. Supplies filled the bed: flour, lamp oil, fencing staples, a coil of rope, and 2 sacks of feed. There was no other passenger waiting. No woman from the ranch. No family member to ease the introduction. Only the giant cowboy and 10 miles of mountain road. "Before I go anywhere with you," she said, "I have a condition." The street seemed to quiet around them. Caleb waited. Sarah drew one slow breath. "If you touch me without my permission, I will leave." I do not care what time it is or how cold the road may be. I will be gone before sunrise." One of the ranch hands near the hitching rail gave a low chuckle. Caleb turned his eyes toward him. He did not glare. He did not speak. The laughter stopped. Then Caleb looked back at Sarah. He saw that her chin was steady, but the fingers inside her pocket had tightened around whatever she carried. He took one deliberate step backward. "Then I won't touch you." No argument, no wounded pride, no demand for an explanation. Sarah watched him for a long moment, as though the answer had unsettled her more than refusal would have. Caleb moved to the wagon and placed her bag behind the seat without reaching for her arm. He pointed to the iron step. "It sits high. There's a handhold beside the wheel." She climbed up alone. Caleb walked around to the other side and settled onto the bench, leaving as much space between them as the narrow seat allowed. He gathered the reins carefully. His hands were large enough to close around a fence post, yet he handled the leather as gently as thread. The wagon rolled through Dry Creek. Sarah kept her gaze forward while storefronts passed. The blacksmith, the wooden church, Martha Quinn's general store, Thomas Avery's small law office, and the county land office with its sun-faded sign. People watched openly, but she gave them nothing to carry home except the sight of her straight back. At the edge of town, the road turned toward the mountains. Sarah shifted her and noticed an old newspaper beneath the supply ledger. A corner had folded upward during the ride. She saw the word Kansas, then another line, "Warehouse fire leaves owner dead, wife still missing." The air left her lungs. Without looking at Caleb, Sarah lowered her boot and pressed the newspaper flat beneath the ledger. Caleb flicked the reins. The wagon climbed toward Stone Hollow Ranch, and behind them Dry Creek disappeared into dust. The road narrowed after the first mile. Cottonwoods gave way to pine, and the ground rose beneath the wagon in long, uneven grades. Sarah kept one hand near the side rail as the wheels dropped into old ruts hardened by weeks without rain. Caleb said little. He pointed out a washed section near Miller's Cut and slowed the team before the bend where loose shale often rolled from the hillside. He did not ask why her hand still rested inside her pocket. He did not glance toward the newspaper beneath her boot. That silence made her watch him more closely. Most men asked questions because they believed answers belonged to them. Caleb seemed able to leave a thing unopened. Near sunset, the trees thinned and the land opened into a long basin of faded grass. Stone Hollow Ranch stood near the western ridge, solid against the dark pines. The house was smaller than Sarah had imagined. 2 rooms built from squared logs, a stone chimney, and a narrow porch facing east. A barn leaned slightly toward the corral. Half the northern fence sagged between weathered posts. Beyond it, a dry channel crossed the pasture like a scar. Caleb stopped the wagon beside the gate. "The lower hinge sticks," he said. "Lift before you pull." Sarah climbed down alone. She lifted the gate as instructed, and the wood scraped over packed dirt. The ranch was not prosperous. She saw that at once. A section of barn roof had been patched with mismatched boards. The watering trough stood only half full. One wagon wheel near the shed had been braced with a split of oak rather than replaced. But nothing had been neglected through laziness. Tools hung in order. Harness leather had been oiled. Firewood was stacked beneath canvas. Poverty and care lived side by side here. Caleb carried the flour and lamp oil inside before returning for her bag. He stopped beside it. "May I?" Sarah looked at his hand, then at his face. "Yes." He lifted the bag and walked ahead without touching her. Inside, the cabin smelled of pine smoke, coffee, and clean wool. A black iron stove stood near the back wall. 2 chairs faced a plain table. A wash basin rested beneath the window with a folded towel beside it. Caleb opened the door to the smaller room. "This was Daniel's." Sarah noticed the pause before the name. The The room held a narrow bed, a cedar chest, one shelf, and a small window facing the barn. The blanket had been aired recently. A brass latch had been fitted to the inside of the door. Caleb remained in the hallway. "It locks from your side," he said. "I don't have a key." Sarah crossed the room and tested it. The latch slid cleanly into place. She opened it again. "Where will you sleep?" "In the storage room beside the kitchen." She looked past him. "There's hardly room for a cot." "There's enough." He carried her bag to the doorway, but did not enter until she stepped aside. After supper, Caleb brought out a sheet of paper, an ink bottle, and a pen with a worn wooden holder. He set them on the table between 2 cups of coffee. "You said you had conditions," he said. "Put them down." Sarah stared at him. "You want them written?" "A spoken agreement changes depending on who remembers it. Paper does not." She sat slowly. The lamp threw light across the table as she wrote in careful lines. She would cook, keep the household accounts, and help where she was able. Caleb would provide room, food, and $6 each month. When Reverend Cole passed through Dry Creek near the end of September, they could marry if both still agreed. Until then, either could end the arrangement. Sarah added another line. Any money or property belonging to Sarah Bennett would remain hers. Caleb read it once. Then he signed. No complaint. No joke about a wife keeping separate property. No demand to know what property she might be hiding in one worn bag. He pushed the paper back to her. "You keep it." Sarah folded it and slipped it into her dress. Over the next several days, the ranch found a rhythm around them. Caleb rose before first light. His boots crossed the porch, heavy enough to make the boards answer, but when he passed her room, his steps softened. Sarah cooked oats, mended a split flour sack, scrubbed dust from the shelves, and began sorting receipts piled inside a wooden box beside the stove. On the 3rd morning, she found Caleb lifting a fallen cottonwood section away from the irrigation channel. He wrapped both arms around the trunk and moved it a few inches at a time, his face tightening with effort. There was nothing unnatural in it, only years of hard labor and a man who understood how to use his weight. That evening, Sarah dropped a tin cup. Caleb bent at the same moment she did. He stopped before his hand reached hers. Sarah picked up the cup. Neither spoke, but the next morning, she left coffee beside his place before he came in. By the end of the first week, Sarah understood why the ranch was failing. The freight receipts showed Caleb paying nearly twice the usual rate to move cattle south. Henry Pike's name appeared on every sale, always beside a price lower than the market listings Sarah remembered from Kansas. Worse, the Silver Run spring permit would expire before winter. She searched the papers again. "Where is the renewal receipt?" she asked. Caleb looked up from repairing a bridle. "I filed in June. There's no county stamp. I handed it to the clerk myself." Sarah turned another page. A folded freight bill slipped from the ledger and fell open across the table. At the bottom, beneath Henry Pike's signature, was a second name, Victor Cole. Sarah closed the book so fast the lamp flame stirred. Caleb's eyes lifted to hers. He saw the color leave her face. He saw her fingers press hard against the cover, but he did not ask. 3 days later, Caleb hitched the wagon before sunrise. "We need roofing nails, lamp wicks, and a new gate hinge," he said. "You made a list?" Sarah held up a folded sheet. The ride into Dry Creek passed under a pale September sky. Frost had not come yet, but the morning carried its warning. Sarah sat beside Caleb with the ranch ledger wrapped in cloth beneath the seat. She had told herself Victor Cole's name on the freight bill might mean nothing. She had not believed it once. Dry Creek was awake when they arrived. Martha Quinn swept dust from the porch of her store. The blacksmith's forge glowed orange through its open doors. A freight wagon stood outside the grain warehouse, loaded high with flour and salt. Caleb stopped near the hitching rail. Before he could step down, a sharp crack split the street. One of the freight horses reared. A broken buckle swung beneath its belly, striking its legs. The team lurched forward, dragging the wagon sideways. Men shouted and scattered. Emma Reed stood near the land office with an armful of files. She froze directly in the wagon's path. Caleb moved. He crossed the street in 3 long strides and caught the near bridle below the bit. The horse threw its head, pulling him off balance. His boots carved 2 deep lines through the dirt. He did not strike it. "Easy," he said. The word barely rose above the noise. The horse fought harder. Caleb shifted beside its shoulder, using his weight against the harness rather than its neck. The second horse slowed. The wagon wheel struck a rain barrel and stopped less than 10 feet from Emma. Caleb kept speaking until the animal's eyes lost their panic. Only then did he release the bridle. The street went quiet. Emma's father came running from the sheriff's office and pulled her close. Martha hurried out with a strip of clean cloth. Caleb's right hand was bleeding where the leather had burned across his palm. A man beside the warehouse shook his head. "One day Turner's going to kill somebody without meaning to." Sarah looked at Caleb. He had heard. His face did not change, but his injured hand trembled once before he closed it. She understood then. The man was not afraid of his own strength. He was afraid of what people would make of it. Back at Stone Hollow, Caleb carried the supplies inside and went directly to the barn. Sarah found him at the workbench trying to wrap his hand with one end of a bandage held between his teeth. "You'll never tie that properly," she said. "I've managed worse." "That does not make this sensible." He looked at her, then set the cloth down. Sarah brought the basin from the house. She washed the dust from his palm and opened a small tin of salve Martha had slipped into the supply sack. Caleb sat with his hand flat on the bench. Up close, it seemed even larger, scarred across the knuckles and roughened by rope. Sarah hesitated. "I'm going to touch you." His eyes met hers. "I know." She laid her fingers beneath his wrist. Caleb went completely still. He did not lean closer. He did not watch her face. He lowered his shoulders, making himself smaller even though there was no way for a man like him to disappear. Sarah wrapped the palm slowly. When she finished, neither moved at once. "Thank you," he said. The words were quiet, but they stayed with her through supper. 2 mornings later, Sarah found a note beside the coffee tin. Martha would deliver the remaining supplies each Thursday. Caleb had arranged it so Sarah would not need to return to town. She read the note twice. When he came through the door carrying firewood, she was waiting. "You told Martha to shop for me." Caleb set the wood beside the stove. "It saves a trip." "Whose trip?" He looked toward the window. Sarah folded the note with careful fingers. "Are you protecting me, Caleb, or hiding me?" His jaw tightened. People stared. People have always stared. "I thought, that is the trouble. You thought for me." The cabin held the dry ticking of the stove. Caleb could have defended himself. He could have said he meant well. Instead, he removed his hat and set it on the table. "I chose for you," he said. "I had no right." Sarah had prepared for resistance. The apology left her with nowhere to place her anger. "Cancel the arrangement," she said. "I will." The following Thursday, they rode into Dry Creek together. After that, Caleb began asking before making decisions that involved her. He asked which section of the irrigation ditch they should clear first. He asked whether to sell 10 head before winter or hold them until spring. He placed the Silver Run records beside her coffee and listened while she explained how the missing county stamp could cost him the spring. They worked through September. They reset fence posts along the north pasture and measured the dry channel with a carpenter's level. Sarah counted cattle from horseback, while Caleb marked the numbers in a pocketbook. Near the house, they planted young cottonwood cuttings to break the winter wind. One evening, Sarah stood beside the unfinished row with dirt on her gloves. "The ranch will need another dozen," she said. Caleb looked at her. It was the first time she had not called it your ranch. He did not point it out. He only pressed the next cutting into the earth, while the last light settled over Stone Hollow. Autumn settled quietly over the ranch. The grass turned pale gold. Cottonwood leaves drifted across the yard, catching against the porch steps each morning before Sarah swept them away. Nights grew colder, and Caleb began bringing in an extra armload of firewood before supper without saying a word. By the last week of September, Reverend Samuel Cole rode into Dry Creek on his monthly circuit. Caleb stood outside the cabin tightening the cinch on his gelding when Sarah came onto the porch wearing the same brown dress she had arrived in. She had washed it carefully and stitched a fresh collar from a piece of cream-colored cotton she found inside Daniel Turner's old cedar chest. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said without turning around. Sarah waited. "You've earned every dollar we agreed on. If you'd rather leave before the wedding, I'll drive you back to town today." She studied the broad back beneath his weathered coat. "If I stay," she asked quietly, "what changes?" Caleb thought for a long moment. "Nothing you don't agree to." She had expected promises. She had expected awkward affection. Instead, he offered her the same thing he had offered on the first day: a choice. The ceremony took place inside the little wooden church. Only 5 people attended. Martha Quinn smiled from the front pew. Thomas Avery stood beside the pulpit with a folded document tucked beneath one arm. Sheriff Amos Reed remained near the back door, removing his hat as the Reverend opened his Bible. Before the vows, Sarah unfolded another sheet of paper. "I have additions." Thomas accepted it and read silently. Caleb watched him without interruption. "The property I brought remains mine," Sarah said. "If the ranch makes a profit after this season, my name appears beside yours in the accounting. No room in this house may ever be locked against me." Thomas looked toward Caleb. "Do you understand every condition?" "I do." "And you accept them?" "I do." Thomas nodded once and signed beneath both names as witness. The Reverend smiled faintly. "I believe that's the most carefully negotiated marriage I've ever performed." Even Sheriff Reed allowed himself a quiet chuckle. The vows were simple. When they ended, the Reverend stepped aside. "You may kiss your bride." Caleb looked at Sarah. He did not move. Instead, he offered his arm. Sarah hesitated only a heartbeat before resting her hand lightly on the sleeve of his coat. It was enough. No one in the room seemed disappointed. Outside, Martha handed Sarah a small loaf of fresh bread wrapped in linen. "For the first supper in your own home," she said. "Our home," Caleb corrected softly. Sarah heard him. She did not answer. Not yet. The days that followed carried both peace and whispers. At the general store, conversations paused when she entered. No one insulted her. No one drove her away. But she felt questions following her from shelf to shelf. Why had Caleb Turner married so quickly? Was she after his land? Would she sell the ranch the first chance she got? Henry Pike tipped his hat politely one afternoon outside the land office. "I hear congratulations are in order." "They are," Caleb replied. Henry's smile remained pleasant. A lonely man can make expensive decisions. Sarah remembered the freight receipts. She noticed Henry's eyes lingered on the leather satchel carrying the ranch ledger before he walked away. That evening, she searched through the records again. One page had disappeared. She knew it had been there, a freight invoice from early spring. She checked every pocket inside the ledger. Gone. The next morning, she reached into the small cloth pouch hidden beneath her spare dress. The brass seal Nathan had once forced her to use was missing. Her heart stumbled. She emptied the pouch onto the bed, needles, thread, a silver thimble, the folded agreement she and Caleb had signed. No brass seal. She searched the room twice before finding it resting on the windowsill. She had never placed it there. She slipped it back into the pouch without mentioning it. That same afternoon, Emma Reed arrived carrying a stack of copied county records. My father asked me to bring these to Mr. Turner. Sarah poured her coffee before opening the first document. Halfway down the page, she stopped. The renewal request for Silver Run Spring carried Caleb's name. The signature beneath it did not. She had copied enough ledgers to recognize careful forgery. Someone had practiced those letters. Someone expected no one to look closely. Emma frowned. I thought it looked different too. Sarah folded the paper carefully. Across the yard, Caleb repaired the porch rail where the summer sun had split the wood. She watched him through the window. If she showed him everything now, he would stop worrying about the ranch and start worrying about her. She was not ready for that. A week later, strong winds swept through Stone Hollow. Near midnight, Sarah woke to a sharp bang. Her bedroom door had swung open. The brass latch hung crooked. One screw pulled loose from the frame. She stepped backward as footsteps crossed the porch. Caleb stopped outside the doorway. I heard it break. Neither moved. I can fix it from out here, he said. Or I can hand you the screwdriver and you can do it yourself. Sarah looked at the broken latch, then at the man standing patiently beyond the threshold. He had not crossed it. He would not unless she asked. She drew one slow breath. You can come in. For the first time since arriving at Stone Hollow, Caleb stepped across the doorway of her room. Not because he chose to, because she had. Caleb repaired the broken latch without a single unnecessary movement. He held the loose brass plate while Sarah tightened the screws herself. When she finished, he tested the door from the hallway. It stayed firmly closed. That should last another 20 years, he said. Sarah managed the smallest smile. I hope the house does too. It will. For reasons neither of them spoke aloud, she believed him. October slipped quietly into the valley. Morning frost silvered the pasture before the sun reached over the eastern ridge. Caleb and Sarah spent their days gathering hay, checking fences, and moving the cattle closer to winter ground. Evenings belonged to ledgers spread across the kitchen table. Sarah had arranged every receipt by date, every freight bill, every tax notice, every payment made to Henry Pike's shipping company. The numbers refused to make sense. Look here, she said one night, sliding a paper across the table. Caleb leaned closer without crowding her. The freight charges? They rise every month, even when you're shipping fewer cattle. He frowned. I never noticed. You weren't supposed to. She pulled another receipt from the stack. And this signature. Caleb studied it. It isn't mine. No. It almost is. Sarah nodded. Almost is enough to steal a ranch. The room fell quiet, except for the ticking of the old mantel clock Daniel Turner had repaired years before. Caleb looked at Sarah instead of the papers. I'm glad you're here. She lowered her eyes to the ledger before he could see how deeply those 4 words reached her. 2 days later, they rode into Dry Creek again. The town was busy with autumn trading. Wagons lined the main street. Hunters carried deer hides toward the tannery. Children chased one another between barrels outside Martha Quinn's store. Sarah stepped into Thomas Avery's office carrying the renewal papers. Thomas adjusted his spectacles and spread the documents across his desk. After several minutes, he frowned. The filing date is correct. So why hasn't the county approved it? Caleb asked. Thomas tapped the bottom corner. Because this isn't the document you signed. Sarah looked up sharply. You can tell. The handwriting matches yours for the first 3 lines. He pointed lower. But the signature was traced. Whoever copied it understood penmanship. They didn't understand habit. Caleb folded his arms. What does that mean? You cross your T after finishing the entire name. Thomas smiled faintly. The forgery crosses it immediately. Sarah exchanged a quick glance with Caleb. Someone had studied him. Someone had planned this carefully. As they stepped back onto the boardwalk, Emma Reed hurried toward them carrying another stack of county records. "Mr. Turner," she stopped to catch her breath. "I found something." She handed Sarah a folded register. 3 other ranches had nearly identical filing numbers. Each belonged to men who had recently sold land to Henry Pike. Sarah felt the air leave her lungs. "This isn't only about water." "No," Thomas said quietly behind them. "I believe someone has been taking ranches one signature at a time." The ride home was slower. Neither spoke much. Late that afternoon, Sarah walked toward the barn carrying fresh coffee for Caleb. She stopped halfway. A horse she did not recognize stood beside the front gate. Dark bay, long trail dust on its legs. Its rider sat easily in the saddle, watching the ranch house without moving. He wore a black hat pulled low across familiar eyes. Sarah's fingers loosened. The coffee cup slipped into the grass without breaking. The rider smiled. Not warmly, patiently, as though he had finally arrived where he expected to be. Caleb stepped from the barn carrying a coil of rope. He followed Sarah's gaze. The stranger tipped his hat. "Afternoon," he called. "My name's Victor Cole." Sarah's face lost every trace of color. Caleb looked from the stranger to his wife. He did not need another word to know. The past had found Stone Hollow Ranch. But by the time spring returned to the valley, the thing that mattered most was never the fear that rode through Caleb and Sarah's gate. It was the quiet choice they kept making after the fear had passed. The water from Silver Run flowed across the pasture once again. New grass pushed through the earth where winter had left it gray. The old latch still hung beside the front door, not as a reminder of danger, but as proof that trust is never taken. It is given, one small choice at a time. People had once measured Caleb Turner by the size of his hands and the weight of his shadow. They learned too late that the strongest thing about him was not his strength. It was the patience to step back when stepping forward would have been easier. Sarah Bennett arrived believing survival meant keeping every door locked. She left that fear behind, not because the world suddenly became safe, but because she finally found someone who honored her voice before asking for her heart. Maybe that's what love looks like when it lasts. Not grand speeches, not perfect days. Just 2 people choosing dignity over pride, truth over fear, and each other over the ghosts that keep calling them back. If you had been standing where Sarah stood that first afternoon in Dry Creek, would you have trusted Caleb enough to stay? If stories about quiet courage, second chances, and hearts that heal a little at a time speak to you, I'd be honored to have you join us again. There are many more journeys waiting beyond the next trail, and I hope we'll ride into them together.